you not address what I've said to you? I mean, I'm trying. Okay, let's just go step by step. So humans have value. It's wrong to stab them in the throat. You follow me on step one, right there, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not trying to be condescending at all. I just want to walk through it step by step. And then step two, if you say there is no trait true of animals that if true of humans would cause them to lose value, you could switch every trait true of the human to match the animal. That would render the human identical to the animal while retaining value. Do you follow me on that?
Well, again, I take it that you think there is a distinction between human beings and other animals, right?
Jack, I'm just not hearing you answer what I said to you.
Yeah, well...
So do you follow what I just said to you?
Yeah, but I don't see the relevance of it.
Wait, so I'm going to ask you to repeat it back to me.
You're saying that human beings would be... human beings are identical to other... or are different from other animals in virtue of some trait, right?
No, I'll be very specific. So we started with humans have value. You follow me on that. Now, the second component is if there is no trait, there is nothing true of animals that if true of humans would cause them to lose value. That means you can switch every single thing that's true of the human to match the animal while retaining value.
But that's assuming that value is given in terms of some trait, right?
No, not at all. It's just saying you could undergo this trait switching and the value for whatever reason remains.
No, what I'm saying is that you could have two identical objects, right? That is to say they share the same physical traits, right? But one has value and one doesn't.
No, okay, wait. There's the mistake right there. Because when you say two identical physical objects, the statement two identical objects is actually it's a what's the word? It's an oxymoron. It's not a comprehensible thing. When you go to physical objects and you're just picturing one ball and another ball, that's not a stage where you can reach contradiction. When I'm talking about traits, I'm talking about absolutely anything that can be predicated of that being. If you equalize all the traits, you are literally talking about the same thing. You're talking about equalizing its location, the molecules that compose it, every single thing down to A equals A.
Yeah, but not the value properties, right?
But if you're saying that the value property is the trait, then you're naming a trait and you're rejecting P2.
Yeah, but that's the point. That's the idea, but behind particularism.
Okay, but wait, I want to make sorry, I just want to it's not useful to talk about particularism without actually just getting the argument clearly on the table and understood, right? So I just want to make sure we're following each other here. So if someone says that humans have value and they say there's no trait, what happens from there is you can say, okay, well, if there's no trait, you can switch all of the traits, but the human retains value. If you can switch all of the traits while the human retains value, then you're saying animals have value because the human is reducible to an animal while retaining value. To then say that animals are valueless produces logical contradiction. So the thing you can't be saying is that humans have value, there's no trait, and I assign differential moral status. That's where you enter contradictory territory. If you're going to say there is a trait and the trait is just my subjective assignment of moral value, that can be a consistent position. That just has some weird outcomes.
Well, I'm just saying that two things can be identical in terms of anything other than their value properties, right? But yet have different value properties, right?
Yep, and it's not if you're saying that the trait is just the value I assign to them, your position isn't contradictory. It's just saying that you're rejecting the second premise by naming the trait my subjective assignment of value.
Yeah, but that's the particularist view.
Okay, so just to be clear, that's not actually picking a logical problem. This is what Avi's trying to get at. That's not actually picking a logical problem with the structure of name the trait.
I wasn't saying there was a logical problem with the structure.
Oh,
right?
okay. No, fair enough. What you're
from the outset that the argument could be formally valid.
And right? what I said from the outset is I'm just going to go in here, interject into your conversation with Avi, just so we can tell precisely where the disagreement is. So the disagreement is not on the validity of the argument. The disagreement is on the fact that you would reject the second premise, and you would reject it by saying, I name the trait my subjective assignment of moral value.
You could put it that way.
Okay, I'll pass it back to Avi. And obviously, I mean, if I continue, just the path that I would go down is just check for consistency. If you subjectively say it's fine to murder 1 million people, is it fine? And then you'd have to go one way or the other on that.
Yep, but their consistency isn't required on particularism.
No, there's problems to not being consistent, but if you can name the trait, then your position at least can theoretically be consistent if it doesn't have some other problem with it. But I'm hogging now, so I'll pass it back to Avi.
Yeah, well, I'm not following why what would somebody would have to be consistent about, right, if one were a particularist, since there isn't actually a principle being appealed to. What would make them inconsistent?
I didn't say that they would be inconsistent. If you're rejecting the second premise, usually you have a position that is consistent. What becomes inconsistent, like Jack, you would agree that even as a particularist, if you make the statement, X does and doesn't have value, all else held constant, you're contradicting yourself, correct?
Well, again,
you're not making that statement. I understand that, but even as a particularist, if you make that statement, X does and doesn't have value, all else held constant, that's still a contradiction. Logic still exists for particularists.
Well, it depends on how we cash out that utterance, right? We can understand it to mean that there are considerations in favor of it and considerations against it.
No. Jack, the considerations, when I say all else held constant, we are holding those constant. Whatever considerations apply equally to both.
Well, I mean, a relativist could say that something.
Jack, sorry, I got to push you on this because you already conceded to this earlier, and it's not even a point against your position. I'm just trying to spell out the problem. You're asking, well, where's the contradiction? I'm not necessarily saying that you have a contradiction because you appear to be naming a trait. The contradiction arises if you actually can't name the trait, and the contradiction exists even on particularism. If a particularist, I mean, lots of us are particularists about aesthetics, right? About what our taste preference is, for example. It would still be a logical contradiction for me to say, my favorite taste is and isn't green apple flavor, all else held constant. That's just saying something and its negation.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yes. Okay. So now what I'm saying is if instead of naming the trait, my subjective assignment of moral value, you actually said there is no trait, the objects are reducible to one another with differential moral status, you're not naming the moral status as the trait, that's where you enter contradiction territory. Now, you have not gone there, but when we're talking about inconsistency, that's where we'd be going, and that would apply equally to someone who's a particularist.
I see.
Okay, and now I'll pass it to Avi. I just didn't want to go misunderstood there.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I would hash out. So you've named the trait, right? Your trait is your particular. That is the trait. And so the argument wouldn't be invalid. You would say it's not sound because you've rejected P2.
That's right.
And, yeah. So name the trait would be a valid argument. You'd say it's not sound because I have a particular, and in this context, my particular is, well, they're not. I don't value them, and I don't need to be consistent about my evaluation. It's just my particular. Yeah. So that's a consistent position, Jack.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is the name the trait argument is impotent against a position like that, right?
Well, in what sense are you saying it's impotent? If you're saying the only way it can be potent is to demonstrate logical consistency, then yeah, it's impotent, but that's not what the argument is meant to do. The argument is meant to sort views into two variants.
Well,
the argument is meant to...
What I meant by saying it was impotent was that if somebody were not a vegan on that basis, it wouldn't be an argument that could establish that they ought to be a vegan.
Oh, for them, no, yeah. No, people can have, yeah. I mean, it's not just particularists that can take that position, too. A non-vegan can have a consistent position that the morally right thing to do, in principle, is to just kill all animals.
Yeah.
And that would be an impotent argument. If you're measuring the potency of an argument by the ability to convert that person, then yeah, it would be an impotent argument. They can have a consistent position against that, consistent principle position against that, and there's nothing inconsistent about it. The only thing we can say is that that's kind of a crazy position, and that we can't have a basis for that.
I don't know what you mean by crazy
there. It just means like we disagree with it. It's like it's not. I'm not saying that there's some founding justification or basis for disagreeing with it. It's just for example, when we look at someone who goes around saying my position is to murder a bunch of humans, that's his let's say that he had that position. Now let's say he's airtight and consistent about that. What can we say about a position like that? Not much. We can't say it's logically. We can't say anything on the grounds of logic. We can't say it's logically inconsistent. All we can say is to ourselves, we think that's crazy.
Okay, that's fine. But I thought that was what Manny was arguing. And so I didn't understand why there was a claim that Manny had lost the debate, right? When all Manny had done was to defend a position like mine, as I understand it.
Yeah, well, the only thing that can be done is to just show that, well, listen, you have a consistent position, but most people, it seems like most people, if we're gonna have a debate, like a public debate, most people would see where your position lies and say that's crazy. And the thing about moral particularism is just in the absence of any principles, basically it's just your particular. So if your particular is to slaughter a bunch of humans, that's your particular.
But that I'm not seeing how that's addressing what I was saying, right? When I was listening to the debate, right, people were coming in and saying Manny had lost the debate, right? And I took it that they meant that Manny had somehow contradicted himself, right?
I see.
No. There's a big problem right there. When we say someone has lost the debate in here, we don't strictly mean that they've contradicted themselves. So, Jack, there's tons, I'm sure you'd acknowledge this, tons of moral positions that are totally consistent, and by the general moral standards that most people hold, having concerns for rights and well-being and stuff like this, those positions would be insane. So, like, Hannibal Lecter has a consistent position, but that would be something that most people would reject as an insane position. So in the context of a moral discussion, the win condition isn't just a proof of contradiction. By that logic, Hannibal Lecter wins moral debates. I think what most people would accept as a win condition is if the other guy gets reduced to saying something like, I don't have a problem with a Holocaust, or a Holocaust is fine if I like it. If they get into any territory like that, I think it's pretty safe to say that they've lost the debate. So that's what we're talking about. We're not always talking about inconsistency. Losing a moral debate doesn't always come down to being inconsistent.
So it's some kind of appeal to popularity? Is that the idea?
Nope. No one's saying that something is true by virtue of the fact that most people believe it. So no.
I thought you were saying it was true that he lost the debate.
It's true with respect to any kind of standard that cares about basic human rights, yeah.
Right, that's an appeal to popularity, right?
No, that's just an appeal to anyone who holds the standard of basic human rights. It would still be true even if that was a minority.
Well, I don't think he said he didn't believe in basic human rights, right?
Well, the statement he ended up making was that the Holocaust doesn't have a negative moral status in his subjective view, which is not even a view that you hold. I mean, you've just said in your subjective view, you actually hold the position that stabbing someone in the throat is wrong. I'm sure I can infer from there that you also, in your subjective view, would say that the Holocaust is wrong.
Yeah, but if I said the Holocaust was right, and there was nothing inconsistent about that, right? What you're saying is that I would lose the debate for saying that merely because most people disagree with it, right?
Yeah, with respect to anyone who holds any kind of axiom along the lines of like maximizing well-being or basic human rights, you would lose the debate by getting reduced to that. Yeah.
Well, I don't know what you mean by maximizing well-being.
Well, we don't need to autistically nitpick. I'm saying anyone who holds any moral position that where their base axiom is just not going to allow for a Holocaust, if you get reduced to saying something like the Holocaust is good, with respect to anyone who holds those positions, which is the majority of society, you've lost the debate. It's not making a logical claim that you've actually contradicted yourself. A lot of people contradict themselves in here, but yeah, that's not what we're always saying.
But what I was contesting was that you said it was not an appeal to popularity.
Yeah, because no one's saying that the truth of something comes down to how many people believe it. We're saying you've lost the debate with respect to anyone who holds a system that values those rights.
Yeah, but when I said it was an appeal to popularity, I didn't mean to say that the claim was that you had made that you had taken a position, right, which people agree.
Jack, would I still make the same claim if one person held that position?
I don't know.
I would. It's not an appeal to popularity. I'm not saying anything is true or moral by virtue of how many people believe it. That's just not what I'm saying. And if anyone's recording, you can quote me. I've never said
Wait, but I'm still not understanding what you're saying, right? So if the majority of people...
Jack,
right,
here, let me explain it. If someone's unmoving base fundamental axiom doesn't allow for X, and your system justifies X, that can be shown, then with respect to their system, you have lost the debate.
Right, so that's an appeal to popularity, right?
No, Jack, where in there have I said that the truth or morality of something hinges on how many people believe it?
I don't think you're understanding what I mean, right? So what I'm saying is, if it were, well, let me ask you to maybe explain. So if it were the case that the majority of people, right, agreed with the person in the debate, right, who you're saying lost the debate, right, would they still have lost?
I'm actually so astounded that you're asking me that. They would have lost with respect to the moral system of anyone who has a base axiom that does not allow for a Holocaust.
When you say you lost the debate, you mean with respect to me, right?
I mean with respect to anyone who holds, not just me, with respect to anyone who holds an axiom that's fundamentally not going to allow for a Holocaust.
No, I'm not following that, right?
Okay,
why is that? What is it that makes that the criterion for winning rather than losing the debate? I don't get it.
The criterion for winning is going to depend on the individual person. Not everyone's going to perceive the same thing as a win or a loss.
Right.
Even, so then, Jack, even in a logical debate, the same thing is happening. Okay, when you show that someone has contradicted themselves, they haven't lost the debate in the mind of someone who doesn't care about logic. Okay, they've lost the debate with respect to anyone who cares about logic, with respect to anyone who bootstraps logic as an axiom. It's the same thing here. They've lost the debate with respect to anyone who bootstraps the wrongness of the Holocaust as an axiom, or bootstraps an axiom that logically concludes there.
I'm not really following that language there, but let me just clarify. So if I say Manny has won the debate, right, because by my lights, right, he had the better position, does that mean that, am I mistaken about that?
With respect to a given system, that may be true. With respect to another system, it may not. It depends on the system.
Okay, so then by lost the debate, you just meant people who who actually think that not condemning the Holocaust in some specific way, right? They're just going to reject his conclusion.
Yes.
Okay. But for other people who don't have a problem with his conclusion, he won the debate, right?
That doesn't necessarily follow, but it may be that he lost, one came out in the middle. It may be that he just has another status with respect to winning to people who don't share that same view on the Holocaust.
Okay, well, I think I understand what you were saying.
Yeah. So the reason that it might come off as an appeal to popularity when it isn't is because I make statements like the vast majority of people hold a system that rejects the Holocaust. The reason we're concerned with things like that is because fundamentally, if we can reduce all carnists to one of the following two things, either inconsistency, which in principle would justify all actions, or an absurd position that justifies something like the Holocaust, which cuts against the moral views of the majority of the population. As long as we can keep doing that, we will gradually push people towards veganism. And then when there's enough of us, we can just legislate against the rest. So the goal in a moral debate fundamentally is to persuade the majority of people listening. If you reduce the other guy to a statement like, oh, you know, the Holocaust, yeah, meh. They have lost the debate in the eyes of anyone who holds a moral system that values basic human rights, which happens to be most people, which means that we've achieved our purpose as vegans in a debate.
Yeah, but it would have been a simple matter for Manny to sidestep that, right, if he had taken my approach.
Well, you probably know how to think a bit better than him. Your approach still leads to Crazyland. If your particular is that you want to rape a child, then that's fine by your system. Most people will reject your system right there. If I show that that's your position in a debate, you lost in the eyes of most people.
Yeah, well, I think that you have a sort of a different aim than I have, right?
What is your aim?
Well, my aim is merely to have a position, right, which survives criticism.
I think your aims are more than that. I think that there's multiple moral positions that would survive criticism, as in they would come out being logically consistent. There's something more to it than that when you're selecting which moral position you want.
I don't know what you have in mind.
Okay, so would you agree that the position that I hate everything and I want everything to die, everything has negative moral value, is a consistent position?
I guess so.
You hold that position?
No.
So obviously that establishes the fact that there's something other than consistency that you're concerned with when it comes to adopting a moral system.
Yeah, I'm talking about my position, right? I'm not talking about any consistent position, right? I want to have my position be a consistent one.
Yes, but the how we got here was you said that you have a different goal in debate than me, and you said that your goal was to have a position that stands up to criticism. So my response to that is I think you actually have more goals than that. I don't think you just want a position that stands up to criticism, as in a position that is logically coherent, because there's plenty of moral systems that are logically coherent that you would just dismiss as being batshit insane. So you're probably going for something like trying to find a position that is both consistent and that your preferences align with.
Well, I wouldn't put it in terms of preferences, but yeah, values. Yeah.
Sure. I don't care about the language of preferences or values, just that you align with.
But the point I'm trying to make is, right, that it's not about trying to get people to accept my values, right?
No, I didn't say that it has to be.
Yeah. So it doesn't really matter to me.
But
right.
Now you're defining it in the negative in terms of what you're not trying to do. Like, I don't care about semantically nitpicking this. It's just a minute ago, you said what you were trying to do is just have a position that stands up to criticism. I put a bit of pressure on that. You say, well, stands up to criticism and, encapsulates my values. And now you're instead of defining what you're trying to do, now you're defining what you're not trying to do, which is persuade others. So I never said that you're necessarily trying to persuade others. Although if that were your position, you would fail the second you hold this kind of angle.
But that's what I meant when I said, right, that you and I probably have different aims.
Sure.
Yeah. So it doesn't really matter to me, right, that people say, oh, that position is crazy, I don't share it. Right?
Oh, yeah. No. What matters to me is just that people understand how to get to the logical conclusion of your position and how to spell it out clearly for everyone to see. Because I'm confident that most humans fundamentally value things like rights and like well-being and will not accept a position that in principle justifies all actions. So for me, the concern is more about the people in here learning to extract what your system, which I consider profoundly evil, actually says, so they can expose it to others and then have others be persuaded away from your system.
Yeah, I understand that. But for me, it's just an irrelevant matter whether the majority is persuaded of my conclusion or not. Right?
Well, it's irrelevant to the truth of the matter. It's irrelevant to whether the position is consistent. It could even be irrelevant to whether you are going to hold the position or not. But it's certainly relevant to us. So if you just want to say that you have different aims, then that's totally fine. But
that's what I said at the outset.
The issues that I picked up on during this discussion. In fact, I'm totally cucking off. Avi, you can talk.
Oh wait, I was like falling asleep. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean the thing is, I mean your aim is. I mean, I'm not actually sure what your aim at Angstreich is, but the point is that for vegans. And in terms of it being a relevant thing, it would be relevant to be able to show the logical extensions of your moral system or lack of system, or principles or lack of principles, and what that leads to, and for people to get off board with that, on board with veganism. And the reason that is relevant, because it's relevant just pragmatically, because if we get enough people, we can just legislate against people from eating animals.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with that. I'm just saying that all I was concerned to show, right, was that you guys didn't actually have an argument against my position, right?
Well, an argument, yeah. I mean, it depends on what you're defining. Like if you're saying what you mean when you say you don't have an argument against your position, you mean, well, you're not going to be able to show it to be logically inconsistent. If that's what you're saying,
well,
then,
you could show it to be false in other ways, perhaps.
Yeah. Or if you can't show it to, you can't verify the negation of your system, or you cannot show your system to be logically inconsistent. If that's the metric by which you're saying you don't have an argument against it, sure. But again, like a lot of people, like what we view it in terms of the way we view this is that an argument against your position would not be limited to those things. An argument against your position would just be in terms of being effective pragmatically, which would just be
effective pragmatically, right? I don't take a position on that.
Yeah, I mean, assuming it was effective, and by effective pragmatically, I mean just getting a bunch of people off your position onto our position, and just eventually just legislating against your position, or what follows from it.
Yeah, I mean, invalid arguments can be pragmatically effective too, right? So I don't have.
And Angstreich, just to be clear, when I'm referring to that kind of argument, I'm not saying it's like valid in the sense that it leads to a truth or falsity of your position.
Yeah, I understand that, right? But see, what I understood the name the trade argument to be, right, was an argument that could show that anybody who eats meat, right, is somehow mired in some kind of moral contradiction, right? And that's all.
No.
Yeah, that's not what name the trade is meant to do.
Right, I understand that.
It's a sorting mechanism, Angstreich. It sorts people into either consistent but absurd, like you, where you have a consistent position that in principle justifies all actions, including infinite suffering, if you prefer it, or into the category of inconsistent. So it's just a sorting mechanism. It's not a claim that all anti-vegan positions are logically contradictory.
Yeah, although the word absurd there is a little bit misleading, right?
Absurd. It's just absurd to whom, right? I mean,
I think what you mean is that it's a position which is unpopular, right?
Well, no. I mean, it's a position which is unfavored among certain people who hold specific axioms.
Yeah. So to those people, unpopular, right?
Well, it could be popular. It could not be popular. I mean, if most
people actually shared my conclusion, right, it wouldn't actually be pragmatically effective. Right?
Yeah, that's true. It wouldn't be pragmatically effective. That's correct. Yeah. So what we can say is we couldn't say it'd be pragmatically effective at that point. What we would say is that it's just we could say lose with respect to just someone who holds an axiom similar to us. You would say not lose to someone say holds an axiom similar to you. Now it just happens to be like in that sense, winning or losing the debate. In that sense, when we're talking about pragmatics again, winning or losing the debate, it's not about showing your position was false. It's not about showing your position is inconsistent. It's not about verifying the negation of your position.
It can be, though, if your position is actually false or inconsistent.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, so that's just the goal. That's the goal of name the trade. It doesn't have to always end up showing the position is false or inconsistent.
Yeah, and so with respect to the two topics that I've heard come up here, which are the validity of name the trait, and then the whether what's his name lost the debate, I think we're in agreement that the argument is perfectly valid. You're just rejecting one of the premises. So I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah.
And wait, just let me finish. And then with respect to the guy losing the debate, you understand that what we're saying is basically twofold, that he has lost with respect to anyone who holds an axiom that fundamentally doesn't allow for the Holocaust. And then the second fold is just that is most of the population.
Presumably, yeah.
Okay, so we don't actually have any disagreement there. We disagree on your moral system, but In terms of the validity of name the trait and what we mean when we say someone is losing the debate or has lost the debate, I think we have clarity at this point.
Yeah, I guess I think the question that I would have is sort of what it is that you think it, to your mind, justifies rejection of particularism.
Well, I mean, if no one's going to talk, I'll talk. Yeah, I mean, I just would not hold particularism because in principle it justifies all actions. I don't think we should hold systems that in principle justify all actions. You can if you want to, I wouldn't.
Yeah, but isn't that the same thing as just restating that you reject it? I'm just asking.
Wait, no. You didn't ask if I reject it or not. If you asked that, I would have said I reject it. You asked why do I reject it, and I spelt out the reasoning. I spelt out what it conflicts with respect to what I care about. I care about a system not in principle justifying all actions.
Well, it doesn't actually justify all actions, right? It's just consistent with any potential justification, right? Particularism is not actually justified.
Let me rephrase. In principle, can justify all actions.
Well, no, I don't think particularism justifies anything.
Well, let's be clear. When you say you're a particularist, you are subjectively assigning moral status to actions, right? Like we established before, you subjectively assign the status wrong to the Holocaust.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. So in principle, you can assign via particularism whatever moral status you want to whatever action. There's not a deeper principle than just your particulars.
It's not a question of assigning moral value to what you want, right? The idea is that you perceive moral values, right? And what you take to be the right or the wrong action, right, is not going to be explained by a principle, right?
Yeah, so is there any action that you, in principle, keyword being principle, would be able to say is always wrong, even in a particularist framework?
I mean, people can differ on that.
But right? the principled answer is no. I mean, unless you hold a particular system that excludes certain actions. But in principle, if you're a particularist, if what you're saying is that the assignment of moral value just comes down to what I subjectively perceive to be valuable. You know, if I see something as good, it's good. If I see it as bad. There's no underlying principles. The fundamental reality there is that can justify anything.
Yeah, but principles can.
Well, no, not yeah, but yeah is the important point, and that's why I reject particularism.
Is it the case that principles can't justify anything?
Principles broadly spoken about could justify anything. Particularism could be talked about as a principle.
Okay, if you're conceding that principles can justify anything, right, then obviously your problem with particularism can't be that it's unprincipled, right? So that wouldn't be a good objection. So what I'm asking you is...
Well, no. The problem right there is that I hold principles that would not allow for a Holocaust to be justified.
That's fine. Right? That's fine. So, but I didn't ask you that.
Yeah, but particularism, that is not a moral system that is going to, in principle, say such a thing about a Holocaust.
Okay. I don't think you're really following what I'm trying to get at. So let me see if I can spell it out, right? If I have a particularist objection to a Holocaust, right, that's just as much an objection to the Holocaust as if I have a principled objection to the Holocaust, right? If I have a particularist judgment in favor of a Holocaust, right, that's just as much a consideration in favor of a Holocaust for that individual as it would be for somebody who has some kind of principle in favor of Holocausts, right? So if you're trying to actually talk about a specific content that you object to, right? It's not actually the case that particularism, or what I'll call universalism, the contrary thesis, it's not actually the case that particularism or universalism, right, entail any content, right? So it wouldn't be a legitimate objection to say that the reason why I object to particularism is because particularism could be used to justify things that I judge to be evil. Because somebody who has a principled view, a universalist view, could have principles that justify those same evils, right?
Yeah, but I think the problem what you're doing there is you're just contrasting particularism to just this broad, vague, general category of principled positions. You could have whatever fucking principled position you want. And I would say that some principled positions are wrong with respect to my principled position, just like I would say that particularism is wrong with respect to my principled position.
That's fine, right? What I was asking for was whether you thought there was a justification for rejecting particularism, right? Because if somebody had particular judgments, right, that aligned with all your principled judgments, right, but they didn't appeal to a principle to justify or explain them, right, you couldn't say, oh, that person has judgments which legitimize things that I oppose, right, because they wouldn't in that case.
Right. No, but their system in principle would justify any of those things if they just particularly want to do those things.
I don't think you're following what I'm saying.
Oh, I'm following what you're saying. I think that you are not following what I'm saying. So, Jack, I'll put it to you nice and clearly, okay? My system does not allow for a Holocaust. Is that clearly understood?
All right.
Particularism doesn't fundamentally oppose a Holocaust. And falsely contrasting particularism with principled views, instead of contrasting particularism with my specific principled view, is basically just a red herring.
Okay, well, let me try to pose the objection in a way that'll make it clear, I think, right?
Sure.
Do you think that universalism is consistent, can be consistent with Holocausts?
Sure, obviously.
Right. And you also think that particularism can be consistent with opposing Holocausts, right?
Well, it depends what you mean. In principle, particularism doesn't actually take any stance on a Holocaust. That's the problem with it.
Yeah, in principle, does universalism take a stance on the Holocaust?
Nope. And I'm going to ask you if you notice the red herring that you're dropping right now.
I don't think it's a red herring.
It is a red herring. You're targeting universalism broadly, which is not what I'm defending. I'm defending a specific system.
What I asked you, right, was if you thought there was a consideration, right, that could justify universalism over particularism.
Again, my dog in the fight is not defending universalism broadly, because there's universalist positions that are profoundly evil. As I've explained countless times in my videos and in this Discord, there's tons of consistent, principled positions that are just dark. I mean, you can go back in this recording that I'm assuming Bacon Bone is taking right now, and you will hear me saying Hannibal Lecter's position is fully logically consistent, and it's completely fucking evil, right?
Right, and presumably
when you start attacking universalism and contrasting it with particularism, and then asking me to defend universalism, it's a red herring, because I'm not here to defend universalism broadly. I'm defending my specific position.
I didn't ask you to defend universalism broadly.
I think particularism broadly fails because in principle it doesn't justify it. Just any action could be justified. Universalism, there are specific universal systems that I don't think fail by my standards, and then there are universal systems that I'll reject. So that would be the issue.
I don't get it. Right? There are particularist systems that could I shouldn't say in principle. There are particularist views, right? Somebody could have a set of moral views, right, that are understood to be particularist in character, right, with respect to any outcome that's consistent with all the things that you take to be good and evil, right? So presumably you wouldn't actually have an objection to that view, right?
I've spelt out my objection repeatedly.
I don't get it.
The objection is that in principle, it justifies all actions. Jack, if tomorrow you wake up and you prefer to rape a child, is that ethical by your system? Please don't pussyfoot. Please don't pussyfoot. Clear answer. It is.
Yeah.
Yes.
But in principle,
and Jack, that is my problem with your system right there.
Yeah, but I don't get it, right? You can wake up the next day and have different principles, right? Or
No. That is a wrong move, because my current principles absolutely do not justify that. In principle, right now, my system does not justify that. In principle, your system right now is ambiguous towards that. It just has a practical opposition because of your preferences or your values.
I'm not seeing what difference that makes.
It's a massive difference. In principle, your system doesn't make a statement about a Holocaust. In principle, my system does make a statement about a Holocaust.
Yeah, but
if that's not a clear moral issue to you, I don't know what would be.
Well, I'm trying to understand, right? If you think there are considerations that justify being a universalist over being a particularist.
No, there are certain particularist positions that I would rather someone be a Jack Angstreich variety particularist than a Hannibal Lecter variety universalist.
Yeah, but see, the question that I'm concerned with, right, is not actually the specific content, right? I'm concerned with the meta-ethical issue, right? The meta-ethical issue is there an argument that can be given, right, to favor universalism over particularism? Right?
All right, so I've spelled out my issue with what you're doing there, I think about 3 times, maybe 4, so I'm going to just call that a red herring at this point.
Well, maybe there's somebody else here who understands my objection.
I understand your objection perfectly well. I think that the thing you're not tracking is that you keep going to this red herring, which is trying to have me defend universalism broadly versus particularism broadly. Well, I don't defend universalism broadly. I defend a specific ethical system, and I would defend that against just some broad, vague, universal position, just as I would against particularism.
Yeah, but if I say to you what justifies your specific moral system, right? Presumably it's nothing, right? Presumably it's just that is the system that you hold to be correct, right?
Well, of course.
Yeah, okay. So that's not the issue that I'm concerned with, right? The issue that I'm concerned with is whether you think, right, there's a way to justify universalism over particularism.
Okay, and have you heard me make any statement about that at all?
I just asked you the question.
So, no, what I've been talking about consistently this entire time is my specific ethical system. I have a general issue with particularism because particularism does not take a principled stance against anything. It doesn't take a principled stance against a Holocaust. It doesn't take a principled stance against changing the well-being to suffering ratio in the universe to infinite suffering versus infinitesimal well-being.
See,
Please don't respond by saying a principled system can do the same thing. I'm tired of that red herring.
Well, I don't understand why you think that's an answer to the question, right? If you
what's the question?
The question is, do you think there are considerations, right, that favor universalism over particularism? Right?
Okay, so I don't know how I could be any more clear. I am Jack, do you think that I am defending just universalism per se?
I have no idea. I simply asked, right, whether you thought that there were considerations that could favor universalism over particularism, right? And what I'm not understanding is why you would think it's an answer to the question to say that the reason why you reject particularism is because it doesn't uphold principles or some specific set of principles.
There you go, some specific set of principles.
Yeah, that's not an answer to the question, right?
Well,
that's just saying, right, that I'm a universalist and I'm this kind of universalist, and therefore I reject particularism.
Well, no, where this started from was you asking about an objection to particularism, and I think that the record will actually show that. And I think that you then sort of shifted into this question of particularism versus universalism, trying to pigeonhole me into defending universalism.
I don't see what difference it makes if the question was phrased, "Do you have an objection?"
Oh, they're hugely different questions.
Well,
Saying,
let me try to clarify.
Wait, no. One second. That's a very important thing. Okay, asking, "Do I have a problem with particularism?" is a different question than saying, "Do you favor universalism over particularism?" Just both simpliciter, both per se. It's a completely different question.
Look,
do you have a problem with X versus do you favor Y over X? That's a difference of question.
The question is, are there considerations, right, that would justify rejecting particularism, right, rejecting particularism and accepting universalism, right? And what I'm saying is, it's not an answer to the question to say, yes, the consideration is that I'm a universalist and I hold to this specific universalist system, and particularism is inconsistent with it, right? That's merely to affirm that you reject.
Yeah. So I think that at this point I'm just going to appeal to the history of the conversation. So I think that it's clear that what Jack started out with was a question about whether I agree with particularism or not. I gave my answer, and then Jack and then Jack gradually moved the conversation into defending universalism over particularism, which at no point have I said I just prefer universalism per se, or simpliciter, or however you want to put it, over particularism per se. That's not what I'm talking about.
I don't know how you could ever have been under the impression that I was in doubt that you rejected particularism. Right?
I was responding to your question.
No, my question was
phrasing. I think I can even remember your phrasing. I think you said something along the lines of, "Is there a justification for rejecting particularism?" It was something roughly like that.
That's correct. And you see, the problem is that saying you are a universalist isn't an answer to that question. It's merely reaffirming that you reject particularism.
No, Jack, you asked me if I reject particularism or if there's a justification for it, and I spelt out what my justification for rejecting particularism is.
Was your justification something other than that you are a universalist who holds to a specific universalist system?
My justification is that I care about having a system that in principle opposes things like the Holocaust.
Yeah, isn't that just to say that you're that you're a universalist?
No. How is that? What the fuck? Jack, do you think that the sentence, "I am a universalist," has the same information content as "I prefer a system that in principle says that there is something wrong with the Holocaust"?
But the point is, somebody who...
No, I want an answer, Jack. Those are not the same sentence, are they?
They're not the same sentence.
No.
But
so please don't try to equate them and say that I was giving you the answer.
I'll explain to you why, right, I did that, right? Because somebody who said, "I'm a universalist," right, and I care about there not being moral systems that reject the Holocaust could give the same answer to the question, right? So it doesn't actually matter what the content of the view is, right? It's not actually an answer to the question, why is it that we ought to think that particularism is wrong, right? Because
okay, so Jack, I'm sorry, I got to cut in. I've given you my answer multiple times. I think that my answer is abundantly clear. The reason for rejecting particularism is that in principle, it can justify any action. That's it. Well, that is the reason. So Jack, here, let me just do this again for you, okay? If tomorrow you wake up and your particular values or preference, or however you want to put it, is to cut a child's eyeball out and fuck them in the socket, is that ethical?
Okay.
No, not okay. Give me an answer.
Pick whatever answer you like. It's not going to affect my objection.
Well,
right?
Wait. I want to hear your answer.
You can choose for me.
I think that you have an answer. Via your system, you should have an answer. If
Fine,
tomorrow,
whatever. It doesn't make
no, Jack. If tomorrow you wake up and your particular preferences, values, however you want to put it, are to cut an infant's eyeball out and fuck them in the socket, is that ethical by your system? Yes or no?
Sure. But
okay.
I don't see what
and that is why I reject particularism.
Okay. But see, I'm not understanding how that's an answer to the question, right?
That's because you have that, Jack. I'm going to kind of steamroll you at this point. That's because you have shifted the question away from why do you reject particularism to a separate question, which is attempting to get me to defend universalism broadly over particularism.
Well,
I was
simply asking if you thought there was any justification for preferring universalism to particularism. Right? Now, if you
universalism. No. That's not the same thing you started with. Your original question was just about why do I reject particularism. But no, I don't think that there is a reason to just prefer just universalism simpliciter over particularism simpliciter. But I think that there are specific universal systems that are preferable to either position simpliciter.
No, I didn't ask you whether you thought they were preferable.
That was a follow-up point.
Okay, so let's just stick to the original question, right?
I've just given my answer to it.
Are you now saying...
Jack, I'm sorry, but I don't accept you calling it the original question. Your original question, unless I just have a horrible fucking memory, your original question was about whether I have a reason for rejecting particularism. That's not the same thing as a question about why I should prefer universalism over particularism. I don't have a preference for one view simpliciter over the other view simpliciter. That's not a position I've expressed at any point in this conversation.
I'm not asking you if you have a preference, right? I'm asking you if you think there are considerations, right, which could justify universalism over particularism.
With no specific universal system, just universalism broadly.
That's correct.
Not any justifications that I would hold to. I'm sure you could generate something, but nothing that I'm aware of.
Okay, well, that's all I was trying to find out. So you basically think that you don't have any kind of an argument, right, to show that particularism is wrong, right?
Oh my lord, Jack, you're just equivocating on these two questions like crazy. I mean, I'm actually in awe that you're not noticing this. Me saying I have a problem with particularism and me saying I don't see a reason to intrinsically prefer one over the other simpliciter. Those are not the same thing.
I'm not saying anything about preference.
I still have a huge problem with particularism. I can spell it out. I can spell it out again for you. Jack, if you wake up tomorrow and you want your preference, your particular view is that you would like to cut a child's eyeball out and fuck them in the socket, is that ethical?
Yeah, but that's irrelevant.
No, Jack, stop. I don't like when you try to dodge that bullet because that's where you die. Is it ethical?
Yes.
That is why I'm not a particularist.
But that's just restating that you're a universalist. Right.
Okay, I'm done. Someone else can hop in. I think that's a thorough wrecking.
All right.
Who else would like to go?
So is there anybody who thinks I guess ask yourself is agreeing. It sounds like he's agreeing that he can't offer any argument in favor of accepting universalism over particularism, right? He just thinks that people who are particularists, right, just have a different way of viewing the world than he does, right? And that's merely what I was trying to find out. I asked the question at the outset whether he thought or whether anybody thinks there's an argument to show that particularism is false, right? That it's a false view of the world, right? It's a false it's a false meta-ethical view. Now, if everybody agrees that there's no argument to establish that, then my question has been answered. If somebody thinks that there's an argument that establishes that particularism is false, I'd be interested in hearing it.
I think it would have been worthy of just being clear on what you mean by justification, because again, like when you say, and I know what you're going to mean, like either a kind of confirmation of the negation of particularism or establishing that particularism is logically inconsistent. I think those are the two things.
I'm talking about epistemic justifications, right? So I'm not talking about pragmatic justifications, right? I'm talking about considerations that favor the conclusion that that view is correct or incorrect, right?
Yeah, and the question is, so when people say, I mean, what it seems to be that if someone shows the extensions of particularism and it leads to things that people wouldn't like, that wouldn't be a satisfactory answer to you as a negation of particularism or a justification that someone should not be a particularist.
Well, that just shows, right, that particularism doesn't correspond to their intuition.
Right, correct. Yeah,
I'm not asking that question, right?
Oh yeah, Angstreich. Yeah, like I mean, Jack, if you're gonna say like can I make a justification for any meta-ethical view over the other? No, I mean I don't think I can justify universalism in a way that I cannot justify particularism. I can't can negate particularism in a way I can't negate universalism. No, it's just the same kind of thing we're doing before. It's just, well, I look at particularism, I look at certain specific forms of universalism, and I just see their extensions and what we agree with. That's all it is.
Well, okay, so we agree then that that nobody knows of an argument that establishes that universalism is more likely correct than particularism as a meta-ethical view, right?
Or the other way around.
Absolutely. But now I guess I have a question then, which is, do you think that universalism presupposes the idea of there being transitivity of preferences?
Can you explain what you mean?
Yeah. So the idea is that a person who prefers A to B, if transitivity held, right, a person who preferred A to B and preferred B to C would have to prefer A to C.
Okay.
So I'm wondering whether you think that the transitivity condition is a constitutive feature of universalism, or if universalism can do without it.
I'm not sure. I haven't thought about that. Is this like somewhere that goes in terms of saying like basically the principles basically just rely on the preferences in the first place, or rely on the particulars in the first place? Is that the kind of argument that you would try to go and get?
The idea that I have is, right, that universalism does presuppose that, right? And so the idea is that a person who chose C over A, right, would have to be judged irrational on a universalist view, right? And what I'm saying is I don't see how they could establish that there's anything irrational about that.
So just to be clear, when you talk about transitivity, can you just explain
transitivity of preferences, right, is the view that preferences are hierarchically organized. So it is to say that it's entailed, right, if the individual is rational, right, that the only way for him to be rational if he prefers A over B and B over C is to prefer A to C when presented with
correct. Yeah.
A or B, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I'm saying is I don't really see how the universalist position, if I'm correct, right, that universalism does presuppose the thesis of the transitivity of preferences, right? I don't really see how the universalist has the resources to establish that there's anything irrational, right, about a person preferring C to A.
Yeah. Wait. So, but first of all, can you make the case that universalism does presuppose the transitivity of preferences?
No, I'm not sure that it does. I'm just saying that I think it may, and if it does, right, that's going to be a big problem for universalism, because I don't see how they could establish that there's anything irrational about preferences being intransitive.
Yeah, I mean, I would just see like universalism as, okay, here's a principle and you apply it consistently. I don't know how it gets to presupposing transitivity of preferences.
Yeah, I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, I mean, my original answer to you, I think is the same. Like, I don't know, I haven't thought about it, but now I'm thinking about it, like, I don't see how it follows.
Okay, but I mean, I don't know. It seems to me that the name the trait argument is basically proceeding on a basis along those lines, right? Saying if
well, we've cleared. I think we've cleared that up, Anstreich. I mean, I mean, I'll appeal to you. Like, do you think we've cleared that up?
Well, you cleared up how the argument works, right? What I'm not clear on is whether it's the case that that argument presupposes transitivity of preferences.
I don't see how it follows that it would presuppose that. How does it presuppose that?
Well, it seems to me that you're basically saying, look, in this case, you prefer A to B, right? In this case, you prefer B to C. But in this other case, you're preferring C to A, and that's irrational.
Oh, I don't think it has to do with... No, it doesn't... no, I don't see how that follows, because it doesn't necessarily have to be that it's relying on saying that you prefer... you even prefer anything. It just has to say that,
well,
okay...
You can... I don't think the language of preferences is necessary structurally to the problem that I'm trying to raise, right? You can just say, given the principle that you, given some principle that you hold, right, you prefer A to B and somebody else, I'm sorry, you prefer A to B and you prefer B to C, right? So it follows that therefore you should prefer A to C, right? So if in fact you currently hold C to be the case, right, then you're irrational, right? Now maybe you don't.
Well, yeah, no, and just to be clear, like that you should prefer A to C if you prefer A to B and B to C. That preference is that, I mean, that ought also. We have to be clear on what that ought means, because that could be just another Humean ought as opposed to like this ontologic epistemic ought, right?
It's not epistemic. Well, I don't think the two are. I think the two coincide there, because I'm saying what you judge to be desirable, right? If you judge A to be desirable, more desirable than B, and you judge B to be more desirable than C, right? Therefore, you ought to judge A to be more desirable than C. So if in fact you believe that...
I actually don't know that last step you just made right there. I don't know if that's like... that when you just said, therefore you ought to judge A more than C. I would just say that if A... I mean, look, I mean, the analogy I would make here is like let's just say mathematically, like if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then you ought to conclude A is greater than C. Would you agree? Would you agree with that statement?
Well, I think transitivity holds in mathematics, right?
Right, but what I'm saying is that ought that I just slipped in there, that you ought to conclude it. It's only an ought if you ought to say A is greater than C if you want to be correct with how you've defined the mathematics. Like that ought in and of itself is just it's like a Humean ought.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about non-Humean. Well, again, when you say Humean, okay, if you just mean by Humean ought hypothetical imperatives, I'm not talking about anything that's not a hypothetical imperative, right? So I'm just saying that I don't see, right, that it follows that one ought to prefer A to C, right, or ought to think that A is more desirable than C, right? Because I think the idea is that if you prefer C to A, you're somehow being inconsistent, right? And therefore you...
No, I don't think that's how it's relying. I honestly, now that I'm thinking more of this, I don't see how it's presupposing this at all. Like, it's just saying that, okay, what is, like, do you have a trait that makes it... Is there a trait? And by trait we mean, just to be fully clear on this, it could be an accidental property, it could be an essential property, it can be an extrinsic factor or an intrinsic factor. It could be any predicate. And just the name of the trait is just any predicate. Is there any predicate difference that makes a difference in terms of one thing having moral value and not the other, and that predicate could include moral value itself? And the answer to that question is going to be a yes, because other than if you want to say those two things, one does not have moral value and one does have moral value, and to say that the answer is no would just be to deny things like identity of indiscernibles, or possibly even the law of identity, because if every predicate changes, then the two things are exactly equal to each other. It doesn't need to. I don't see how it's relying on if A is preferable to B and B is preferable to C, then you ought to conclude A is preferable to C. It's just a statement. The name of the trade is just a shifter of views based on the identity of indiscernibles.
Well, are you familiar with Peter Singer's argument about the drowning child?
I'm familiar with his argument about the drowning child. But before we get there, I just want to be clear that we're on the same page about this argument.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to determine whether there's a structural parallel between the two arguments.
Yeah, I've heard this. This is not the first time I've heard this structural parallel try to be made between the drowning child argument and name the trade. And I understand that. I don't think that there is. There may be in some ways, but I don't think it's in the way you're trying to make it to be. But just in order to fully hash that out, just do you understand what we're saying when we make the name of the trade argument? Like, what is, like, you tell me, like, what's the idea behind it? Like, what is it? How does it get to the identity of indiscernibles, and how does that show logical contradiction?
I think so. The idea is something like, if you can't show me a trait that distinguishes the two entities in question where you're taking different moral attitudes towards, right, and you switch out all the traits, then you don't actually have a principled basis by which to favor one over the other. Right?
No. It's not that you don't have a principled basis to which favor other. You don't have a principled or particular basis to favor one over the other. It could be it's also the same. It applies the same to a particularist. So because if all the traits are the same, then your particular is the same too. Remember, it's any predicate. It could be an accidental, essential, intrinsic or extrinsic property, which would include your particulars.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. So, do you think that the Peter Singer argument is a good argument?
It depends on if you share certain beliefs or certain principles that Peter Singer had, and I think Parfit also kind of used this example of the drowning child in his address. But it depends on if you're a particularist, it's not going to be a persuasive argument to you. Obviously not. Because if a particularist would just say, well, it's my particular that in this case, I would save the drowning child, but in the case of Africa, I wouldn't donate my money. And that's the difference is just my particular. So for a particularist, I don't think that would be a persuasive argument. If someone holds to moral principles and can't differentiate the principle that and shares the principle that Peter Singer has, then it would be a persuasive argument. But what name the trait, the difference between name the trait and Peter Singer's drowning child argument is the name the trait argument, in terms of its validity, would include the particulars. The name the trait argument, it would include accidental, essential, extrinsic, and intrinsic properties. And so you could actually even make the case that Peter Singer's argument maybe is invalid, not just not logically sound, it would be invalid to a particularist in a way that name the trait would actually be valid, although you can reject the premise and it wouldn't be sound. So I think there's a fundamental disanalogy there. Because name the trait would just say accidental, essential, extrinsic, and extrinsic properties all equalized. That would include a logical contradiction for a particularist, because the particulars would be equalized in that case.
I'll have to think about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, it sounds like what you need then, what you'd need to have a really knockdown argument would be to be able to show that particularism is false.
No, I'm not. Well, yeah, if you want a knockdown argument for particularism is false, sure. I mean, I don't have a knockdown argument for particularism is false. I'm just trying. Right now, I'm just talking about name the trade and how it's not analogous to the drowning child. Because I've heard this case be made. I've heard the name the trade argument be drawn up as an analogy to the drowning child argument, whether it's Peter Singer arguing for it or it's Parfit like mentioning it in his address. And I think that's unfair. I think that a particularist. And the reason I think it's unfair is I think a particularist would say for the drowning child argument that the argument is just straight up not valid. However, properly understood, the name the trade argument, a particularist would actually have to say that it is valid. However, it's not sound because they reject a premise on the basis of their particular. That's the fundamental difference. Now, in terms of before we go on to particularism, like, do you understand what I'm saying there? Like, that's the fundamental difference. Like, one's just straight up not valid to a particularist.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm just saying that it seems like I understand that you think that on rhetorical or pragmatic grounds, you're in a strong position because you think most people are going to reject
Wait, before we go there, Jack, before we go there, I mean, I want to stick on one issue at a time.
Uh-huh.
Let's stick on the, before we move off the analogy, I want to just make sure, because this is an analogy I've heard made a lot, and that the implication is that name the trade is logically invalid for the same reason, to a particularist, for the same reason that Peter Singer's drowning child argument is logically invalid.
Well, I'm not making it.
Right. Okay, that's fine. It's just it's just my impression is that
it sounds like if you didn't want to rest your laurels on pragmatic and rhetorical considerations, right? It sounds like what you really need is an argument against particularism.
Yeah, for sure. No, I understand that. And look, I've told you before that, look, people have moral systems because they have moral systems, and at the end of the day, they agree with them. And you agree with particularism, and I don't agree with particularism. And I think that's the best I can say, and that's the best descriptor I can give. But again, I just want to make it clear. I just want it to be very clear, because my interest here is, like you mentioned up this analogy, and I want to make it clear because I want this analogy to end for name the trade, because I don't think it's fair to analogize name the trade with Parfit's drowning child. With Peter Singer's drowning child, and Parfit mentions it in his address. I don't think it's a fair analogy. And could we just agree on that? There's a reason why that's not a fair analogy, even for a particularist.
Well, I think that what you've said is very interesting, and I'm going to think it over.
Okay, that's all I wanted. Because on all the other issues, people have moral systems because they have moral. People have meta-ethical views because they accept it. People have normal theories because at the end of the day, they agree with it. And the only thing I can say, only thing I could really rest on is the pragmatic laurels, in the sense that most people don't want a system that if your particulars change and you want to slaughter a bunch of people, then that would be ethically justified. And it's not that's me just reaffirming that most people want a principled position. Yeah, that's all I'm doing. Sure. Because I don't really have much more to say. I think we both agree on that. The only contention I had with you in this entire, fully understanding everything, the only contention I really saw was the fairness of that analogy. And I just don't think that's a fair analogy. So I'm happy that I can clear that up with you, and I hope you do think about it, and I'd like to talk to you again when you do think about it.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I was just hoping that somebody thought they could motivate a universalist view. But it sounds like you guys don't feel like you have an argument like that.
Well, Angstreich, what would, in your view, what would motivate you off? What do you think would motivate you off particularism to take principles?
I really have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and I have no idea what would motivate me to go off principles and take a particular stance. Like, so that's the problem, right? So I mean, I mean, even if you think, even just take a second and think about, like, hey, is there actually anything that would motivate me off this view? Like, can I actually think of anything that would motivate me off this view? And I don't think you can actually honestly name something that would motivate you off the view. And I don't think right now I can honestly name something that would motivate me to be a particularist, just on a philosophical basis. So to me, that's not the interesting question. To me, like, all I can say, again, I hate to belabor the point, but all I can say is just show the logical extensions of these two views and rest on my pragmatic laurels. That's all I can really do, and I'm going to continue to do it. But that's not interesting to me. Like, the only thing now, the analogy you brought is interesting to me, and I want to, and it's interesting because on two levels, because I do think that rests on a philosophical case where I can actually show that, hey, on a logical level, because we both accept the axioms of logic, on a logical level, I can actually show you that this analogy is not fair. It's not. That's actually not a just analogy, and that's the interesting conversation. And I just like to see that analogy go away for name the trait. That's all.
Yeah, well, I don't have a strong view on that. That's just an intuition. But I guess I think that there's something about universalist views that I really find hard to understand psychologically, which has to do with the idea that if one actually discovers that one has differing moral perceptions, right, that one ought to understand those things in terms of principles, and thus revise a moral judgment in order to be in conformity with a principle.
Yeah, and then they would say, the people who are universalists would say the exact opposite thing to you. They would say that they have a psychological difficulty in understanding why you would structure it in terms of particulars. I mean, you're just going to talk past each other. I don't see where that's going to go.
Well, you may be right. I'm not sure, though.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, it's good talking to you. I mean, because the thing is, like, with these conversations, like, the reason I don't find it interesting is because, like, it's just like I don't think we're at a point where, like, there's anything that I'm gonna be able to say to convince you off particularism, and I don't think there's anything. And by your own admission, because you don't even know if there's anything that would convince you off particularism, and by my own admission, I don't think there's anything that could convince me off having principles. So it's not really the interesting. Like, there's not much I can do with that. There's not, like, I don't see it as the interesting point. But the thing you brought to the table, the things that you brought to the table with name the trait, that's an interesting point, because we've clarified. I hope at the end of the day, someone's mic is popping off. Can you please mute? Thank you. The interesting thing for me to do, what I can do, is clarify how name the trait is used and how it's fundamentally different than Peter Singer's child drowning in the puddle. That I can do because that rests on an axiom that we both share, which is logic.
Well,
so I should be able to convince you that.
I would like to understand, right, how you would deal with a case like that.
With a case like, okay, yeah, sure. I actually, we've made a 2.5 hour video on how to deal with it. If I can DM it to you, actually.
Okay.
How to deal with Peter Singer's drowning child in terms of in terms of constraining positive rights.
The kind of question I'm asking is, right, imagine that you had competing moral intuitions, right, and you never thought about them being in conflict, right? But you thought one thing was okay to do and another thing was not okay to do, right?
Yep.
Is the idea then that there must be, so the idea is there must be something to make them in conformity with each other?
Yeah, there are ways of setting up, like, there are ways of setting up different opposed normative axioms and structuring them in a consistent way such that you would employ one over the other in certain cases and not the others based on a certain principled metric. You can do that.
Well, no, what I'm trying to get at is, so you start out by saying, okay, it can't be the case that one is right and one is wrong, right?
At the same time, correct. In the same situation at the same time, it cannot be the case that diametrically composed answers can be right or wrong at the same time in the same case.
But that's only because you have a prior commitment to universalism, right?
Well, it's only because no. All things being held equal, that's because I have a commitment to logic. Because of all things, I'm saying if all things being held equal. So in the same case, in the same context, in everything held equal, I would say that the diametrically opposed answers cannot both be, like, things cannot be true and not true at the same time. That I would actually reject on the level of logic.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about that kind of a case, right? I'm saying that it just seems like this one is right and this one is wrong, right? And I can't point to something in virtue of which that's the case, right?
Yes, and that's what I have have spent a lot of time dealing with, and I've dealt with that, and I've structured what we call. I mean, I don't know if I want to call this a system based on value pluralism, because value pluralism they view it as commiserable, or in the sense that they can't be traded out against each other. So I call my system a polyaxiomatic system, or I would describe myself as a polyaxiomat. And then there's a basic principle in how it's structured in terms of which system is deployed over the other. And it's not to say that one is true and not true at the same time. There's a metric which tells me which one would be the case and not the case. So I've developed that for positive rights and negative rights. In terms of positive rights, we have like a 2.5-hour video on how to do this specifically to the case of Parfit and Peter Singer and the drowning child. And I have a graph for the negative rights version. But your case only deals, in my view, your case that the argument for the drowning child only deals with the positive rights version. But what I would tell you is that I do believe that there's ways to deal with this argument that don't require you to be a moral particularist.
So you're saying you affirm value pluralism?
No, I don't want to say that, because I don't think value pluralism fully captures what I mean. So I'll tell you what I mean, and you can tell me if you think I'm a value pluralist. So I think that there are two things that matter in my system. I have a value of deontology and I have a value of consequentialism. In the context of negative rights, which are actions that inherently violate the interests of others, I value the deontologic rights violations, and I have a certain value set for those. So, and I also value, for example, the consequences that stem from those actions, but I don't value them equally. That being said, one can eventually outscale the other. So, for example, like the classic way to understand this is like the trolley problem. So, would you kill one person? Like, I'll just ask you the question. Would you, in the trolley problem, would you kill one person to save 5?
I don't know. I might.
Yeah. I would say no. My answer would be no. Now, let me ask you, would you, I'll post the graph soon. Actually, you know what? I'll post it now. Hold on. Let me find it. Okay, I'm posting in general chat. Okay. So, I would not kill one person to save 5. Now, let me ask you the question. In the trolley problem, would you kill one person to save a billion people?
Probably.
Yeah, me too. I absolutely, yeah. I would say yes. Would you kill, I mean, and you say probably. I mean, I'll push it further then. Would you kill one person to save a omniverse of people?
Yeah, I mean, that's my guess as to what I would do.
Right. I mean, and the point is, as I go up, your confidence is in what you would do would be greater and greater. I'm assuming, right?
I would imagine.
Yeah. So the point being in this is that in terms of me, if I want to be a universalist, if I want to base my views on principles, and I want to give different answers, right? I need multiple axioms. I need more than one axiom in my ethical system, and I need not just in multiple axioms, and I just pick and choose whenever I want. I don't want to pick and choose the axioms like a particularist, right? Because you can have multiple axioms and you can choose your axioms the way a particularist would choose their axioms, or you can choose your axioms based on a principle. So in a polyaxiomatic system, you can actually have a polyaxiomat who's a particularist, and you can also have a polyaxiomat who's a universalist. So I take the polyaxiomat universalist view, and I say that in the context of actions that specifically violate negative rights, that specifically cause some amount of interest violations. So, for example, the classic example would be murder. What I would say is that murder would be wrong in virtue of deontology at the base level. At the base level of the well-being. So the graph would be y would be moral value, positive would be good things, negative on the y-axis would be bad things, and the x-axis would be the well-being to suffering ratio produced by the action of murder. Now, at some point, so you can say killing one to save five, that has a positive well-being to suffering ratio, all things held equal. However, at that point, I would say I would prefer deontology to consequentialism. Now, as you go up and you eventually scale up the well-being to suffering ratio of the act of murder, eventually there will be a switch point. I will deploy consequentialism instead. Now, you'll notice the switch point is arbitrary. I don't have a justification for the switch point. However, in the sense of the word arbitrary being not logically justified, if I'm a subjectivist, I don't really think that any of these normative theories are justified. They're just things I agree with. So I'm just describing something I agree with, and it's still operating based on a universalist way of picking axioms rather than a particularist way of picking axioms. So what I would say, and then there's a similar way of doing this for positive rights with with Singer's example that Parfit used also with the drowning child, but it gets a lot more complicated. But all I would try to get across is that there are ways. You don't have to be a moral particularist to get around the drowning child problem and not resulting yourself in being a slave and donating all your money. Like you don't have to be a moral particularist to do that. I don't know if that's your motive. Like, I'm not suggesting that's your motivation for doing it, but I want to be clear, like, in case that was a doubt in your mind, like, I don't think you have to be a moral particularist to get there.
Well, it's not really helping me understand the deliberation process, right? So I'm just trying to understand, right? If you had a moral intuition, right, that seemed to be in conflict with another moral intuition, right, and that was brought to your attention, right? So like in the drowning child case, right? Would you say that it's in virtue of the fact that there's a prior commitment to universalism, right, that you would think you'd have to actually revise your actions, right, your habitual actions, right, to be in conformity with a principle, or is there something in the nature of the case that motivates universalism?
I think this is just getting back. I feel like it's just getting back to what motivates Like, to correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this just getting back to what motivates universalism over particularism? Like, if you're a particularist, if you're a universalist and you're faced with this issue, and you have a commitment to universalism, you're going to have to deal. This is something you have to grapple with. If you're a particularist, I agree. This is probably going to be easy. Like, this is going to be very, very, I agree. It'll be easy for you. You're going to easily be able to say, well, I reject the drowning child example because I'm a particularist, and the difference is my particular. What I would say, though, is the fact that you have an easy answer to this case, I don't see that as a justification for particularism, because I don't see the ease of your deliberation being a justification for particularism. Not to say that you claimed it to be so, but I would just say that the reason I'm not finding it interesting is because nothing I'm going to say, nothing we're going to discuss here is going to make one view more founded than the other. I don't think so. Do you think one view will be more founded than the other?
I don't know.
Yeah. So all I can say, the interesting thing to me, all I can say is that you can be a particularist and get around the drowning child example without donating all your money away. You can also be someone who holds to principles and also get around the drowning child. And as far as the deliberation process, I don't think quite frankly, Jack, I don't think the deliberation process would justify one view over the other either way.
You might be right, but I was just trying to understand whether it's a prior commitment to universalism, right, which motivates you to revise the view, right, or if you come to universalism from meditating on those kinds of cases.
Oh, I can answer the question. So it's interesting. So I've had some examples of both in my life. In my life, actually, my first example in my life was I came to universalism with the issue of the trolley problem and on the negative rights issue. So in the issue of the trolley problem, what I realized is that, I want to be able to say, I'm not going to kill one to save five. However, I do want to be able to say, I am going to kill one to save a planet of people. And the conclusion that I came to was not, well, I'm just going to do that by saying I'm a particularist, even though you can do that. I can do that by saying I'm a particularist. But the conclusion I came to is like, wait a minute, when I really deliberated, when I really thought about it, I was like, okay, wait a minute, I need my principles, and I need to know where my principles switch off. That's the conclusion I came to, and that was the liberation I came to. Now, whether I said, okay, I'm just going to have a prior commitment to it and revise it, I don't, maybe some people may do that too, but I don't think either answer to that question is very relevant in terms of providing an argument for one